I'm delighted to be chairing this evening's discussion, which marks the launch of the book, The Economic Consequences of Mr. Brown, by Professor Stein Ringen, who's Professor of Sociology and Social Policy at Oxford University. So I understand it, and Professor Ringen is going to set out his argument in some detail in the next 20-25 minutes. The period of his book covers the period predominantly when Gordon Brown was a Chancellor rather than Prime Minister. And so, unfortunately, from Gordon Brown's point of view, the point of comparison is not between him as Prime Minister and Churchill as Prime Minister, but between him as Chancellor and Churchill as Chancellor, which is, I suspect, a rather less flattering parallel, based on Keynes' famous pamphlet in 1925, The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill. We're also joined by the distinguished columnist and commentator Polly Toynbee, who I think it's probably fair to say could be described as a supportive critic of much of the period of government that the book covers. And it'll be very interesting to get her reflections on what I think, at face value, certainly having just read the synopsis, is a fairly, in one sense, depressing conclusion about the effect of 10 years of Labour government between 1997 and 2007, which predominantly comes to the conclusion that in the end an effective and quite powerful government was frustrated by a constitution and system of government that meant that it wasn't able to achieve what it wanted. Anyway, without further ado, let me introduce Professor Stein Ringen.
That is Mr. Brown's brilliant slogan for his economic policy. Prudence for a purpose. Prudence is the budget, the use of money, the inputs, and purpose is what it's about, the outcomes. By that standard, by the standard of purpose, New Labour in government is a failure. The purpose was, inspired by values of social justice, to break with the Thatcherite legacy of reckless inequality. But under New Labour, Britain, far from becoming more equal, became a more unequal society. More unequal economically in the distribution of income, and more unequal socially, for example, in health inequalities. That had happened before the economic crisis, during the good years from 1997 to 2007. The economic consequences of Mr. Brown are negligible, not much for the good, not much for the bad, just nothing. However, this is only the trivial part of my story here this evening. What I'm really here to talk about is why. And that will shift my attention very quickly from questions of this or that government to questions of the Constitution. This evening is an argument about the British Constitution. Now, a more detailed picture of prudence for a purpose might look something like this. On one side, inputs, management of the budget, money into priority areas, money buying new inputs. And on the other side, results and outcomes. Now, when we lay out Mr. Brown's economic policy in this way, the story is very good on inputs on this side. Very good, and we'll see some of that. However, when we look to outcomes, there is nothing or next to nothing to show. In the process from prudence to purpose, it all peters out so that in the end, there is nothing. In my study, I've looked at 4 core policies: child poverty, healthcare, crime, education, and then overall inequality. The assessment is on the government's own terms, prudence for a purpose. I've used the best available independent research and evidence, and I've looked mainly at the good years from 1997 to 2007. I comment also on economic growth and on the crisis after 2007, and we can come back to those matters in the discussion if you are interested. So inputs then. The story is very good. Mr. Brown, as Chancellor, was a master of the budget. More money was put into priority policy areas. More public investment. Public investments went up. And new policy instruments were put to use, for example, tax credits in the fight against child poverty. So on the side of inputs, the story is very, very good. But then again, nothing or next to nothing follows through to results in outcomes. So let me take you through the story of the National Health Service. Start with the National Health Service and follow this line from inputs to outcomes. Massive new money was put into the National Health Service. In 5 years, from 2002 to 2007, real spending on the NHS increased by nearly 50%. And that additional money bought new inputs, new hospitals, clinics, more and better equipment, more doctors, more nurses. Waiting times are down, at least in some forms of hospital care. So, on the input side, all is fine. But even here, even with that investment of resources, it all petered out. And it petered out in the meeting with 4 obstacles. First, internal inflation in the National Health Service. By the best independent estimate, £4 in every £10 of new money went to paying more for what was already there. Now that's an estimate. It can be debated and discussed, and it will be debated and discussed. But what is clear is that a good slice of the new money went to paying more for what was already there. Second, by a loss of productivity. Each pound in the NHS bought less of services. And this is one picture of the difference between the trend in inputs and in outputs. These are national accounts figures, and the 2 top lines are different estimates for how much went in, and the dark bottom line is an estimate of how much came out in the form of services. So we see that the provision of services fell seriously behind the addition of resources into the NHS. This is a big difference that we see here, and a big fall in productivity. Third, the investment of new money was hit by an increase in demand resulting from demographic change, from aging, so there were more patients needing more care. And fourth, the investments were hit by a neglect of public health and preventive health care. All the money went into curative services, with preventive measures being neglected and starved. Now, how all this adds up in a complicated system like the NHS, we don't know precisely, but we know something about the volume of services, of public health services, that flowed through to patients. And what we know is the following 3 trends. First, there was an increase in the volume of services that flowed through the hospital line, through the hospital sector. The hospitals produced more healthcare services. Second, there was stability in general practice services. In the general practice area, the volume of services produced did not increase and did not decrease. As far as we can read from the statistics, barring small fluctuations up and down year by year, they were stable. They Should have grown, of course, but they were stable. And the third line, in long-term care, the volume of services there was sharply reduced, certainly in England. So the three main lines of providing services to patients, hospitals, GPs, and long-term care, one increased, one was stable, and one decreased. Were then more services delivered per patient? Well, we don't know, but probably not. Were more services delivered per patient relative to need, to increasing in need? Probably not. Probably not. It's not a provable proposition, but probably not. If you follow through and look at real outcomes and health indicators, Britain continues to perform badly by European comparison. There is nothing in average health status of the population, nothing new in average health status of the population to reflect the new investments. And then health inequalities increased. Let me say a few things about child poverty, Mr. Brown's flagship policy. This is a picture of what happened. That is the percentage of children living in households in poverty. Now, what that picture basically shows is nothing. I mean, basically nothing. It remains that about a third of children in Britain live in poverty. Now, there are some small movements up and down on that chart, and in the book I comment in detail on those small movements, but basically this picture shows nothing. Of the small movements, what happened was that a long upwards trend in the rate of child poverty came to an end in 1994, 3 years before New Labour came to power. Then the rate started to edge downwards, and that's when New Labour came in. And then, after Mr. Brown introduced tax credits, the new instrument to combat child poverty, the rates of child poverty again increased. They should, of course, have decreased, but they increased. And the reason for that was that underlying income inequality then shifted towards increasing inequality, and the policies that were in place were not capable of protecting children against the fallout from increasing underlying inequality. That was exactly the story during the 1980s, when inequality increased and child poverty rates rose continuously. Children were not protected, and they are still not protected. In crime, after the new money was put in, a long trend of falling rates of crime was interrupted, and the level of crime stabilized. Only in education is there some success. Here, long-term trends of improvements in educational results were maintained and not interrupted or lost. Now, that's not much of a success, but at least it's not outright failure. It was at poor value for money. Here also productivity declined, and again, inequalities persisted. All in all then, in individual policies, nothing or next to nothing follows through. And in the overall purpose of breaking the back of inequality and introducing a melody of social justice, nothing, absolutely nothing. So the question then is why? Why did this happen? And the answer to that is extremely difficult and paradoxical, because this was a government, New Labour from 1997 to 2007, that should have succeeded. It had everything. It had power, it had money to work with from economic growth, it had mandate, it had vision, it had ambition, it had activism, it had sincerity, everything. And it was a competent government. There is here a real tragedy in the Greek meaning. The gods gave the ladies and gentlemen of the new Labour government everything they could want and dream of and ask for, and then the gods denied them any benefit from that gift. Now, Mr. Brown and Mr. Cameron shout at each other in Parliament, one saying, "We have succeeded," and the other saying, "You are incompetent." They are both wrong. The story of New Labour is not a story of a government that failed because of incompetence. It is an intriguing story of a government that failed in spite of competence. Now, partly, the government made bad decisions. On child poverty, they used the wrong instruments and they did not put enough money in. They were warned early. In the NHS, much too much money was put in much too quickly and with much too much political spin. The result being that budget discipline in the complicated NHS organization was lost. On health and crime, preventive policies were neglected, and everything was invested in reactive and controlling measures. So there were policy mistakes, and there is much to learn from them. But even that is not much of an explanation, because we have to ask, why did a competent government mess it up for itself with bad decisions? And the deeper explanation then lies in the system of governance and in the Constitution. Now, in looking into government policies in detail, as I've done here, it quickly becomes visible how extremely centralized the British system of government now is. Everything is decided in and run from Downing Street. The rest of the country, and that includes Parliament, certainly the House of Commons, is on the receiving end, more under command than in partnership. Now, the absence of mobilizing policies in this review is legion. The population was not mobilized politically to rid the nation of the shame of child poverty and to repay its debt to its children. The professions in healthcare and schools were not rallied and encouraged. Neighborhoods were not mobilized against the scourge of antisocial behavior. People were not mobilized to take care of their health. The government commanded, and everyone else was controlled. Now, the level of social control in this country is now ferocious, and it's continuing day by day, and it is counterproductive. A country of 60 million people just cannot be run by a handful of politicians in the capital. It must be governed through leadership in which the government persuades others, from its own civil servants to citizens at large, that its project is good and worthy. It must encourage them to engage with and work for that project. No government can succeed by power alone. It must use power softly and carry people along. It can only succeed if it is able to mobilize the efforts of the millions. That cannot be done by command, which is counterproductive, but only by leadership, by showing people confidence, and by awarding professionals and others trust and authority. New Labour, for all its showmanship and spin, neglected the art of leadership, in particular inside the vast apparatus of government. Doctors, nurses, teachers responded to bigger budgets and better salaries by working less productively, in a silent revolt against the style of management by a technocratic and, from their point of view, authoritarian government. Political power is dangerous for its holder. A strongly centralized structure of governance, of decision-making, is a recipe for mistaken policies. It makes it too easy for too few people to decide too much. Too much power is a recipe for mistakes. It deprives those decision-makers of the prudence that comes with the awareness that their decisions will be checked and double-checked and scrutinized by others with independent authority. The government made mistakes in policy because all governments are inclined to make mistakes, and because this one denied itself the resistance by which it would have forced itself to plan its policies with necessary care and intention. It made mistakes that it should have protected itself against. During the last 30 years or so, the British Constitution has been drastically reshaped, and much more than is generally recognized, with political power being ever more concentrated in Downing Street. Mr. Blair and Mr. Brown inherited Mrs. Thatcher's centralization. Had they broken with that legacy, they may have succeeded. Instead, they slipped into continuing it and, inadvertently perhaps, undermined their own cause and condemned themselves to ever more effort for ever less gain. The lesson of New Labour is not finally of a failed government, but of an ungovernable constitution. If New Labour, with all the gods gave them in 1997, could not rule, then no government in this country can. At the next election, as in 1997, the voters will throw out a discredited regime, but the change of regime will again be of no consequence. What Britain needs is not a new government, but a new constitution. Now, British politics is regrettably trapped inside a culture of constitutional conservatism. And no scandal appears to be strong and powerful enough to shake up this entrenched conservatism. Even when there is some sense in favor of constitutional reform, as there was for a short while after the claims crisis, nothing comes of it because there is no sense of priority. Everyone has his or her pet project, and all of them come on the table at the same time. No priority, no leadership. Let me therefore conclude this evening by offering you Professor Ringen's agenda for constitutional reform. First, restore the House of Commons as the central political authority in British democracy. That's easy to do. Parliament could do it themselves. There's no need to wait for any government to do it or to take an initiative. It's for Parliament to do. And it's enough to reshape the committee system in Parliament. For Parliament, the House of Commons, to take control over its own agenda. It is unheard of in other democracies that the government controls the legislature's agenda. Take control of its own agenda and institute routines of pre-decision scrutiny in committee, in the House of Commons, of all legislative and budget decisions. In Parliament, reform is urgent in the Commons, much more so than in the Lords. Second, reinvent local democracy. And it needs to be reinvented. As it is, Britain just does not have proper local units to devolve power to. The Conservatives now say that they want to delegate locally, but it will not work. We will see again exactly what we have seen with New Labour. Bad, well-intentioned, but badly planned decisions that do not work. Britain needs a system of municipalities, and Britain needs many more elected representatives locally, and probably fewer elected representatives in Parliament. And third, straighten out political funding and the way we pay for politics. Now, the failure to dent child poverty, which is shocking. Shocking that nothing of consequence was done to child poverty. The failure to dent child poverty is not a reflection of British values. It is not because the British people do not care for their children. It is a reflection of something being wrong in the system of decision-making. And a part of what is wrong is the degree to which politics and private money are bedfellows. We need to cure politics of the narcotic of private money donations. And we know it. We've had repeated scandals from the Bernie Ecclestone affair and down. And today, on this day, the unions are unashamedly, without any disguise, twisting the arm of a desperate government with the leverage of their money. My recipe is the following. Make all political funding public. Ban all donations from individuals, businesses, and unions, and distribute public money as vouchers to voters for them to give to their party of choice or to throw away. Ladies and gentlemen, last week in Washington, President Obama reminded Congress of their duty to get done what we were sent here to do. Here in Britain today, the Constitution is now such that no government can get done what it is sent here to do. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Ringen. I don't know if I was going to ask Polly Toynbee to try and cheer us up, or to, but at least you must find yourself in a slightly unusual position, having been a leading critic of this government, and particularly its record in relation to achieving some of the major social objectives it set itself, to then think how you respond to such a devastating critique yourself.
Well, Guardian bloggers will always regard me as a snivelling, grovelling New Labour sycophant. I find your book absolutely fascinating, riveting, brilliantly concise. I mean, wonderful to have a book that says so precisely and so economically exactly what it intends, with a huge amount of information, tremendously well written. I mean, I really strongly recommend this book. But I also have to say, have a strong drink. If you ever had hopes of this government, if you ever had any enthusiasm in the year of 1997, in that May morning, prepare to have them shattered here. I mean, I think that the book is too dark. I think it's a hugely useful polemic, and I think there's absolutely no disputing all of the facts and evidence in it that come from the most reputable sources there are on all of the subjects that it covers. But I think what's missing in it is the political context and any sense of the possible. I think that the government came to power, but it was not at all sure it came to power with a mandate to cure inequality and child poverty. In fact, it was a couple of years. It wasn't until 1999 that Tony Blair actually came up with a pledge that he would, the most amazingly ambitious pledge I've ever heard from any politician in my lifetime, that he would abolish child poverty by 2020. Mind you, when he said it, all of the experts who were there in the room said, he can never do it, it's impossible. And I think most of them are not surprised that it has proved to be so difficult. Nevertheless, it was hugely ambitious. But it wasn't the mandate that he felt that he had in 97. If you remember that little pledge card, Matthew probably wrote it, it had 5 very precise and achievable, smallish, but good targets. It certainly didn't go banding about the idea that all child poverty was going to be abolished. Ambition came perhaps a little later, and perhaps even was regretted, because it was never spoken again. And whenever Brown or Blair went to the city, or to people who were not charities for the poor or party conferences of the faithful, they never mentioned it. As you rightly say, they lacked the leadership to embed that as part of the national endeavour. They lacked the nerve. I think that I think you said that there's some success in schools. I think that what's happened in schools has been really pretty good. I think you would expect it to take a very long time to turn around a system like that. It takes a long time for kids to get through school. I think Sure Start is one of the best things that Labour has done. I hope that the Tories will keep up with their commitment to it. It takes a very long time for those children who have been helped in Sure Start to work their way all the way through to the crucial barrier of 16 and getting those 5 vital GCSEs. We are still seeing children who haven't had any of that, and a relatively small number of children have had Sure Start yet. These things take a very long time to set up and embed. But there's no doubt that the teachers and anybody you choose to ask and any measurement you choose to take are of far higher quality than they've ever been before, with far higher qualifications. Teaching has become far more desirable for top graduates than it's ever been before. Schools have become far nicer places to work, far more attractive, most of them. Life for a teacher is better with more time set aside. And as a result, it is drawing people in. And the OECD and the PISA studies show that quality of teachers is what matters in the long run. But it is in the long run. I mean, you're Scandinavian. Social democracy wasn't built in a day in Scandinavia. It took quite a few decades to really change those countries into something that we now so hugely admire. Health, again, I think, is very difficult because we all know that it's not hospitals that change health, but it is what happens in the community. It is poverty and inequality that make our health standards much worse than other countries, and that countries' health standards are pretty much related to how equal or unequal they are. So those things are all interrelated, but nevertheless, there's no doubt that abolishing waiting lists just about has been a phenomenal success. You might say that's a political success. It may not have hugely helped health, but it certainly helped support for the NHS. I think the passionate support we've seen for the NHS in recent weeks over the Obama debate comes partly through the success in doing that. If we still had 2-year waits for hips, I doubt we'd see that. And without a political support for the NHS, then the other things won't flow either. Again, we had a huge shortage of nurses and a huge shortage of doctors. Many more of them are there, all right? They're not quite as overworked as they were. You can call that lower productivity, but there's a lot of dispute about very difficult figures about what productivity in the NHS really means. And I think the NHS is in much better state of health than it was. As it feeds through to better cancer results and better heart death results, but it's true, overall, we still lag behind other countries that, of course, themselves are pushing ahead. Poverty is a great tragedy, but Labour has been running up a down escalator. You could say the escalator is partly of their own making. If only they had capped the wealth, runaway wealth at the top, which The Guardian was writing about today, then maybe it would have been less of a task. But they always had the illusion they could pull up to the middle, the people at the bottom, and not worry about the people at the top. That would be the deal. But of course, poverty is a relative measure, and that's impossible. I think they have tried quite hard. Crime, I'll leave for the moment, though I think the figures are better than you suggest. Murder's down 20%, that's not too bad. I think that you have to imagine what the alternative would be. You know, we are not Scandinavia. We are a country that would otherwise have had a Conservative government that wouldn't have tried half as hard to do any of those things. You seem to imply from your thesis that actually it would be just the same. And indeed, you said in your closing remarks, it's not going to make any difference when the Conservatives take over. Well, let's wait and see. I mean, let's hope we don't wait and see. We probably will. And the idea that it's going to be no different anyway, I think it'll be a bit of a rude awakening for anybody who thinks that. And particularly this time, when we've never before had a Conservative party committed to cuts before being in power. Certainly Mrs. Thatcher was never that rash. I do agree with so much of what you say about the lack of leadership, of how afraid they were, how scarred they were by those 18 years out of power, how they couldn't believe that they were really there, and they couldn't believe they really had the power that you describe, the money, the power, the ambition, the vision. they never quite thought that they were in possession, that it might be taken away at any moment. Partly, perhaps, for something you've left out altogether, and historians and social historians tend to leave it out as a footnote in history: the state of the press in this country. If we look at British exceptionalism, what is it so odd about us? I think without doubt that one of the most important things that's so odd about us is the appalling press we have, run by millionaire press barons, mavericks, a group of three of them, bent on bringing in the most neoliberal, neoconservative policies they can possibly manage with immense power. Murdoch has over 40% of the press, plus Sky. Barclay Brothers immensely powerful. Rothermere, absolutely, Daily Mail, hugely dominant. And they speak together as one huge, horrendous voice, enough to frighten the life out of governments. You probably don't read the Daily Mail every morning, is my guess. But if you're sitting up there in Downing Street and you've got the Sun, the Express, the Mail, Telegraph, shouting at you every day, it feels quite frightening. Why people read it? Well, that's another difficult problem. Why they don't read The Guardian more? I don't know. But it has always been a deformity, right back from the days of the 1930s, the battle between Beaverbrook and Northcliffe, when Northcliffe, on his deathbed, asked, how did you make the Daily Mail so successful? He said, I give them a daily hate. And it still works. And it's very, very difficult for a left-of-centre government to deal with that. And a right-of-centre government has all of that behind it, pressing it on all the time. I think you're right about the Constitution, though I'm not quite sure. All of us who talk about the Constitution tend to look at everything that we think is wrong and put our own remedies to it. And they're not necessarily, it seems to me, a congruity between what you see as Labour's failings and the precise remedies that you suggest, though I like them all. Of course, the House of Commons. Of course, funding should have public funding for paying for parties and get millionaires out of it. Localism, I think, has become a bit of a panacea because we've tried everything else. But you look at local government, and I'm not at all sure. I think the idea that David Miliband had of strong cities with strong mayors has a lot going for it. Sort of city regions has a lot going for it. But you look at a lot of local government, and I don't see much hope there of regeneration. Councillors' average age between, I think, 65 and 68. And they're nearly all men and the people who are retired. Everybody else is too busy and too exhausted. And there is not much sense of life and rejuvenation there. And the idea that you give them lots of power and suddenly, like a million flowers will bloom, people will all suddenly say, I want to be a councillor because I've got real power. I don't quite see that as a mechanism. Localism in other countries springs from ancient traditions, whether it's having cantons or regions of a kind that we just don't have in this country. I'm not sure it's easy to create. I do think when it comes, though, to Parliament, and this is my own particular hobby horse, Parliament will only get back authority once there is proportional representation and one party is not totally dominant. I mean, what's the point of a Parliament if one government party can just push through everything it wants to do, and only coalition making as a strength, not as a weakness? I mean, there again, Mandelson today talking about, well, of course, coalitions are weak and you can't have a government that pushes through its policies. Everything worse that Labour has done would have been prevented by a coalition with the Lib Dems. Everything worse that the Tories may do would be prevented by a coalition with the Lib Dems. There's no doubt. And when you compare our House of Commons with other countries, I think you're mainly thinking of countries that actually have first-past-the-post systems. I don't think you're thinking of America. I think you're thinking of proportional systems. And I do think that you can't have one without the other, and I'm sure that's also your view. I'll stop there. There's so much to be said. But I don't think we should totally give up on the idea that high spending, high ambition, high social purpose is always destined to fail. My fear is that your book falls into the hands of David Cameron and George Osborne, and they say, look, even progressives say, it's useless, it doesn't work, it's hopeless. Let's cut back on the spending, and, well, we'll be as we were before, but we won't have spent so much money. And I think that's a risk, and I think it's essentially not true, that spending is part of it. And it wasn't all wasted. Thank you.
Before I open the debate out to the floor, can I just abuse my position and ask a question myself, which is that I suppose that, to me, one of the questions listening to both of you actually is that if constitutional reform is desirable, then the obvious question is how can it happen without, what's the impetus to make it actually happen without there being the kind of major shock which has led to constitutional reform in other countries? Because there is a sort of circularity to this, and the agenda for reform that you set out is very similar to the agenda reform, say, set out by Charter 88 in the late 80s, early 90s. There were things which New Labour was committed to, if not hugely believing in, certainly having policies towards in opposition, which it didn't really do in government. And as you hint, the Cameron opposition at the moment talks quite a lot of this reform language, particularly about wanting the House of Commons to be stronger and about decentralisation. And yet there's a question about whether that would actually happen. So I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more about what you think the process is that would make reform happen.
Well, I think I should first tell Polly two secrets. And one is that I do read The Guardian in the morning. And as a result, I have written an article, which was published a couple of years ago in the British Review of Journalism, called Why the British Press is Brilliant. I have suffered much abuse because of that article, but I'm still willing to basically defend the idea. The other secret is that I happened to vote a few days ago in a national election in another country than this one. And I did vote for the Labour Party there. And I do indeed remember 1997. And for someone like myself, and I'm a natural Labour sympathizer, how absolutely fantastic it was. You know, it was going to be a new era. I remember it very well. And I was for a very long time, very much on the position that you articulated today. Then okay, well, it's not everything, but it's. So I'm certainly not someone who has been looking for arguments to criticize the Labour government. And if there is anything more personally that inspires this, it is, the outrage that nothing really has been done on child poverty in a country that owes its children so much. And children and families are treated very badly in this country. My view, I have it in the book, is that there ought to be a much more generous, universal child allowance. It's the best way of combating child poverty, and there are 100 other reasons for giving families and children more support. Rather than fiddling around with tax credits that are so finely tuned that just small mistakes in the way they are implemented make them impotent for their purpose, as they have been. So that's the secrets in the confessional. Then there's not much disagreement between you and I. It's just a disagreement of emphasis and nuance, really. I wouldn't quarrel with what you say about schools. I agree with you. I've showed this productivity. Now, productivity, both in the National Health Service and in schools, is a very complicated concept. In schools, in particular, it may not be such a bad thing that productivity is going down a bit. It may mean more attention to the pupils. Productivity as measured in national accounts. So, all right. So on schools, I don't quarrel with you, although when one looks again at the outcomes, taking Gordon Brown seriously on prudence for a purpose, the performance indicators have been increasing steadily for a very long time. They're still doing that. But there's nothing new in performance indicators reflecting the very big input of new money. It's very good on the input side, again, but there's nothing new in the performance indicators we have to reflect that input of new money. Now, on constitutional reform and how it would happen. Personally, I don't think anything will happen. I'm extremely pessimistic about this because I think, again, that the British political culture is trapped inside an absolutely pervasive constitutional conservatism. And I know it I've now been participating a few years in debates on constitutional reform in this country, including with many politicians and in many events with a great number of MPs and members of the House of Lords. And what has struck me in those discussions is that there is no disagreement at all about the Constitution being in a bad shape. Everyone agrees with that. But there's absolutely no stomach for doing anything about it. A reflection of this was in an otherwise absolutely excellent book on the British Constitution by Anthony King, called The British Constitution, the most recent great survey of the British Constitution, who lays out the way in which the Constitution has declined and fallen apart in the last 30 years. And then he says, what should be done? And he said, nothing. Nothing. And this constitutional conservatism, I think, is very difficult to break. It didn't break with the claim scandal, when it looked like there was some kind of momentum, a scandal large enough and serious enough to trigger action. It didn't happen. It was forgotten very quickly. And I don't think it will happen. If it were to happen, it would have to be that some influential persons on both sides of the political debate came together and were able to act as a catalyst in some way for constitutional reform. It should be the Speaker of the House of Commons, but of course the Speaker's office is not equipped to do this kind of thing. It should be there. It should be in Parliament. It should not be the government. It should be Parliament. But Parliament, House of Commons, is unable to act as an institution. They just stand against each other. A few times we see the House of Commons acting as an institution, and it is then excellent. The House of Commons is brilliant. It is full of absolutely first-rate, brilliant politicians. And we see it on the few occasions when they debate serious issues and have a free vote, so that each member of Parliament can formulate their own opinion. They are absolutely brilliant, but mostly they're not allowed to do anything.